Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we are actually talking about the IRS, or the Internal Revenue Service, here in the United States. This is the tax collecting body of the US, if you're outside of the US and didn't know that, and they are basically enabling facial recognition very shortly, and this is what we have to talk about here, because I think we are going too far with facial recognition and the government, and I would say that for any government. Now this is coming from Krebs on Security, aka Brian Krebs. And I'll be quoting and paraphrasing him a lot here. And so a lot of his words, until I get to my own analysis, are simply his. Now, with that, here's what's going on. If you have created an online account to manage your tax records with the US's Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, those login credentials are actually going to stop working later this year. Now, the IRS said that around the summer, or by the summer of 2022, the only way to log into irs.gov will be through ID.me, which is an online identity verification service that requires applicants to submit things like copies of bills and identity documents, as well as a live video feed of their faces via some kind of mobile device or possibly your desktop computer. Now, ID.me was originally launched in 2010 with the goal of helping e-commerce sites validate the identities of customers who might be eligible for discounts at various retail establishments like veterans, teachers, students, nurses, first responders, all of whom usually get some kind of discount depending on where they go. Now, currently and more recently, ID.me is perhaps better known as the online identity verification service that many states here in the US are now using to basically have the mitigation of all of these losses of billions of dollars in things like unemployment insurance claims, pandemic assistance claims, all those kinds of things that are happening. We've seen a massive amount of theft during the pandemic of these kinds of things, and ID.me was contracted to basically start stemming that tide. Now, about 27 states or so are already using ID.me to screen for identity thieves applying for benefits in someone else's name, and now the IRS is basically joining them. The service requires applicants to supply a great deal more information than is typically requested for online verification schemes, such as scans of driver's license or other government issues IDs, copies of utility or insurance bills, and details about their mobile phone service. What an applicant basically doesn't have, or if they don't have one or more of the above, or if something triggers potential fraud flags with ID.me, then they may require you to basically get on a recorded live video chat with an ID.me employee to essentially validate who you are. And so Brian Krebs himself went through the sign-up process, which doesn't seem fun. I'm not going to recount his entire ordeal, but it apparently took him hours to do this. In other words, if you step away for a certain amount of time, you have to reset and start over and all of this. It took him hours with some apparent frustration here in his writing, and he eventually had to speak to an ID.me rep live to validate his identity, and he did get it done, and he was able to log into his IRS account using the ID.me. Now, part of the slowness, as Krebs points out, basically helps defeat the attackers and the scammers that would leverage things like bots that use things like automated signups. But my issues here are multifold. And so think about it this way. Basically, ID.me is collecting a ton of personal information and adding its users to a facial recognition database. This is a technology that isn't bulletproof. I literally did a TED Talk talking about this and other things very similar to facial recognition. And with enough reconnaissance on a target, it seems like if I were essentially a scammer, I could run an identity theft scam and sign a victim up for ID.me. Now remember, even through a video live chat, there are tons of filters, deepfake editors, etc., that may allow a criminal to spoof another person and possibly get away with it. Oh, I'm sorry, my connection is choppy, blah, 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 and here I am talking about, whoever it is. And so that's obviously a deep concern. So I'm not going to show them Nick the criminal's face. I'm going to show them, my victim's face in some kind of format. And we've seen these kinds of filters. There was a famous case of a woman basically going live. I think it was on TikTok in China or one of the Chinese social media platforms. And she looked like a 22-year-old makeup, whatever. And it was like a 54-year-old woman or something like that. That literally just happened in the last year. I remember reading about that. and she accidentally forgot to adjust her filter and put it on, and so everybody saw her real face for the first time, and that was kind of a bomb dropping in China. So these things do exist. Now, I'm the first to say that we have a broken identity system here in the United States. I wrote an article for Forbes like 3-4 years ago on this very subject, and my premise was essentially that we are using as our core ID essentially a ID platform that was created in the 1930s, and that is our social security numbers. And thanks to Equifax and other massive data breaches, our social security numbers are no longer secure. But try going to the Social Security Administration and changing it, you are going to have a really hard problem. You can ask the CEO and founder of LifeLock, who splashed his social security number across billboards all over the place, had tens of thousands, literally, of scams attempted to run across him, and they wouldn't change his social security number for that. So there you go. We have a broken ID system. But we also now have an over-reliance on facial recognition that has gotten governments, not just the United States as well as state and local governments, but also internationally. This has gotten multiple governments in trouble in the past, not to mention things like false positives that law enforcement have unfortunately acted upon here to disastrous results. And we've seen that, and it's to the point where some cities like Oakland, California, for example, and others are actually banning facial recognition. And yes, I am all for jumping through hoops to validate your, who people are, especially when you're talking about something as sensitive as the IRS, because if you can file fraudulent tax returns to say the IRS owes me a lot of money, odds are they're not going to audit it and they're going to send it to wherever the scammer is. But there has to be an understanding between the balance of technology leveraging versus privacy of citizens of a country. Now, ID.me claims to be secure, and according to the Krebs article, that they are basically adhering to NIST cybersecurity guidelines, but can they actually prove it? With all the information that they are collecting, can they produce reports from third-party cybersecurity auditors that prove their data storage and other security controls are fully in place? And what about the innovations in cybercrime? Can they pivot to meet the massive identity theft issues that could be combined with deep fake technology, as I pointed out earlier? Do they actually have that ability, or are their processes set, and now we might see a whole lot of innovation scamming around ID.me, and now what's the point of using them? And what about the IRS accounts? There are hundreds of millions of Americans that pay taxes. Are we going to be waiting months or years to get an ID.me account because they don't have the staff to get on video chat constantly? And how many of these are they going to flag? And are they going to be able to hire and train the army of employees this is going to take? And does that employee hiring include federal background checks and training on sensitive information handling? And if it does, will that also cause a backlog? Now, there's no easy answer here. I'm just going to be straightforward here, but we do have to have this discussion as a nation. Our privacy shouldn't be violated to make the government's job easier. They already have a ton of information on us, including pictures, especially if the citizen has a driver's license, a state ID, a passport, a firearm license that many states require, and more. So where does this really end? And why can't they use those? If I walk in, my driver's license is going to look like me. And if it doesn't, well, that's a flag. These are things that we can discuss, but we have to have this discussion overall about what the next logical steps are. And there are a lot of basically identity management solutions out there that can help identify people. Nothing is foolproof. I'm not saying anything is. But to give ourselves over again to a facial recognition database that is essentially managed by a third party for the government seems deeply concerning because, quite frankly, we don't have adequate attestation of security controls from either entity. So that's your food for thought. That's your news of the day. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I am not a fan of what the IRS is doing, and I do recognize their need for better security because they are constantly getting ripped off, not to mention hacked themselves. They've been hacked multiple times criminally in the last decade or so. So this is a huge problem all the way around, but it should not have to come at the expense of our own biometric information, and that's where they're going. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please stay private. Thanks, everyone.